The last words my ex ever said to me were, "Love doesn't pay the bills, Claire." Everyone standing in that restaurant laughed. His new girlfriend laughed the loudest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stood there, holding the engagement ring I'd spent 6 months saving to buy. Because in that exact moment, I realized something. Daniel wasn't leaving me because he had found someone better. He was leaving because someone else had offered him a price. And 12 years later, the same man walked into my company, using a fake name, begging for a job. He had no idea. The woman sitting behind the CEO's office door was the same woman he once called a waste of ambition. He thought he was starting over. He never realized he had just stepped into a game I'd been preparing for over a decade. But before I tell you how Daniel destroyed his own career, you need to understand why I never forgot the look on his face that rainy night in 2001. If you enjoy revenge stories with shocking twists and satisfying endings, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, if someone betrayed you for money, would you ever give them a second chance? My name is Claire Bennett. In the spring of 2001, I was 26 years old. I lived in a tiny apartment on the north side of Chicago. The wallpaper peeled from the walls. The radiator rattled every winter. My old Honda Civic had more rust than paint. But none of that mattered. Because every Friday evening, Daniel Harper and I would sit on the apartment roof, sharing cheap takeout, dreaming about opening our own business one day. Not a huge company, just a small consulting firm, enough to build a quiet life together. At least, that's what I believed. Daniel had always been charming, the kind of man who could make strangers laugh within minutes. He remembered birthdays, held doors open, complimented waitresses. Everyone loved him. Everyone. Except people who did business with him. He changed jobs almost every year. Every time, it was someone else's fault. My boss doesn't appreciate talent. My coworkers are jealous. The company has no vision. I believed him. Love has a strange way of turning excuses into truth. One Saturday morning, I woke before Daniel. His notebook was lying open on the kitchen table. Normally, I respected his privacy. But one sentence caught my eye. It wasn't a diary. It was a business plan. My business plan. The marketing strategy. The pricing model. Even the company name I'd invented months earlier. Northbridge Consulting. I smiled. He'd finally started believing in our dream. When Daniel walked into the kitchen, I hugged him. I knew you'd come around. He looked confused. What are you talking about? I pointed at the notebook. Our company. For just 1 second, his smile disappeared. Then it came back. Oh, yeah, I've been thinking about it. Something about his voice felt wrong, but I ignored it. 3 weeks later, Daniel got a new job. Or at least, that's what he told me. He suddenly started wearing tailored suits, driving rental luxury cars, eating at restaurants neither of us could afford. Whenever I asked how, he'd grin. You'll see. Our lives are about to change. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Then came June 14th, 2001. The day everything fell apart. Daniel called me around noon. Wear something nice. I have a surprise. I thought. Maybe he was going to propose. Maybe he'd finally found investors for our company. Maybe this was the beginning of the future we'd planned. Instead, it became the funeral of our relationship. The restaurant overlooked Lake Michigan. Crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths. Live piano music. I felt out of place the second I walked in. Then I saw Daniel. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman I'd never seen before. She looked elegant. Expensive pearl necklace. Designer handbag. Perfect smile. She had to be at least 15 years older than us. When Daniel saw me, he didn't look guilty. He looked relieved, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Claire, he stood. I'd like you to meet Victoria Sinclair. She extended her hand. Her diamond bracelet sparkled beneath the lights. It's nice to finally meet you. Finally? What did she mean? Finally? Daniel didn't ask me to sit. He didn't ask how my day had been. Instead, he took a deep breath, then said words that shattered 4 years of memories. I think we should end this. The restaurant suddenly felt silent. Even the piano seemed to disappear. I stared at him. What? He smiled awkwardly. I've met someone whose goals match mine. I looked at Victoria. She smiled politely, almost sympathetically. I laughed, because I honestly thought this had to be some terrible joke. Daniel, stop. This isn't funny. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out the apartment key I'd given him, and placed it on the table. It's over. I looked from him to Victoria, then back again. You're leaving me? He nodded. I've been offered opportunities. You could never understand. I whispered. What opportunities? Victoria answered for him. My family owns Sinclair Capital. We're expanding. Daniel has a very bright future ahead of him. That's when I understood. This wasn't about love. This wasn't even about Victoria. This was about money, status, power. The shortcut Daniel had always wanted. I slowly removed the engagement ring from my purse, the one I'd planned to give him that evening. Without saying a word, I placed it on the table. Daniel looked surprised. You were going to. I nodded. Not anymore. Then he leaned closer, lowered his voice, and delivered the sentence that would echo in my mind for the next 12 years. Love doesn't pay the bills, Claire. Victoria smiled. The waiter quietly looked away. People at nearby tables pretended not to listen, but they heard every word. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked toward the exit. Halfway to the door, I heard Victoria ask Daniel one question. So, what's her business idea called again? Daniel laughed softly. Northbridge Consulting. I stopped walking. My heart skipped a beat. Northbridge. That was my name, my dream, my company. The notebook. It had never been our plan. He had stolen it. And at that moment, I made myself one promise. I would never chase Daniel. I would never beg him to come back. But one day, I would build the company he thought he had taken from me. And when that day came, he wouldn't even see me coming. I didn't go back to our apartment that night. Not immediately. Instead, I drove aimlessly through downtown Chicago. The city lights blurred through my tears. Every traffic light felt longer than the last. Every radio station seemed to be playing love songs. By midnight, I found myself sitting in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I ordered coffee. It went cold before I took the first sip. For 4 years, I'd built my future around one person. In less than 30 minutes, that future no longer existed. Or so I thought. The next morning, I unlocked the apartment door. Silence. Daniel had already packed everything he wanted. The closet was half empty. His favorite leather jacket was gone. Even the coffee mug he'd always used had disappeared. But one thing remained. His notebook. The same notebook that contained my business plan. I picked it up, turned the pages slowly. Every page was familiar. Because every idea, every pricing model, every client strategy had come from conversations we'd had together. Conversations where I did most of the talking. He hadn't created anything. He had simply copied me. Then something slipped from between the pages. A folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. At the top, the Sinclair Capital logo. Below it, a typed sentence. Northbridge Consulting Proposal. My heart stopped. That wasn't possible. Daniel hadn't just stolen my idea. He had already presented it to Victoria's family, weeks before leaving me, which meant the breakup had been planned. Long before that dinner. For the first time, I didn't cry. I got angry. Real anger. The kind that burns quietly. The kind that doesn't disappear. The kind that changes people. I looked around the apartment one last time. Then I said something out loud. Not to Daniel. To myself. You'll never steal another dream from me. Over the next few weeks, life became brutally simple. Work. Sleep. Repeat. I stopped talking about Daniel. I stopped checking whether he called. I stopped asking mutual friends about him. As far as I was concerned, he had made his choice. Now, I'd make mine. One evening, while working late, my manager asked me to deliver some files to a retired executive named Margaret Lawson. She had recently left the company after nearly 40 years in business. Everyone respected her. Some people feared her. I knocked on her office door. She looked up from a stack of paperwork. "You must be Claire." I nodded. "I have your documents." She smiled. "Sit down. I've been wanting to meet you." That surprised me. "Me?" She nodded. "I've been reading your client reports. Most people your age solve problems. You prevent them." For nearly an hour, we talked. Not about Daniel. Not about my broken engagement. About business. Negotiation. Leadership. When I finally stood to leave, Margaret asked one unexpected question. "If someone stole your idea, what would you do?" I froze. "Why would you ask that?" She smiled knowingly. "Because your face changed the moment I said it." I hesitated. Then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I told her everything. The notebook, Northbridge, Victoria, the restaurant, the humiliation. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she quietly leaned back in her chair. Then she laughed. Not at me. At Daniel. He made the oldest mistake in business. What mistake? He thought ideas create companies. They don't. People do. I frowned. What do you mean? She stood, walked toward a bookshelf, pulled out a dusty binder, then placed it in front of me. Inside were business plans she'd written 20 years earlier. Some had succeeded. Most had failed. You know why? I shook my head. Because execution beats ideas. She tapped the binder. I can give this to 100 people. 99 will fail. The one who succeeds will be the one who refuses to quit. Those words stayed with me. Execution beats ideas. Not revenge. Not luck. Not connections. Execution. The next Saturday, Margaret invited me to lunch. She brought a yellow legal pad. And one question. If you had to start Northbridge tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd need? I answered without thinking. One client. She smiled. Wrong. I looked confused. You need credibility. No one hires a company. They hire someone they trust. For the next 18 months, Margaret became my mentor. She never gave me money. She never handed me shortcuts. She made me earn everything. She taught me how to read financial statements, how to negotiate contracts, how to spot dishonest partners before signing anything. Most importantly, she taught me never to confuse confidence with competence. Meanwhile, Daniel's life looked perfect. Mutual friends couldn't stop talking about him. Luxury vacations, country clubs, magazine interviews with Victoria. Every photo looked flawless. Every headline praised Sinclair Capital's rising young executive. Sometimes, I wondered if I'd been the fool all along. Then, one rainy afternoon in late 2003, everything changed. Margaret walked into my office holding a business newspaper. Without saying a word, she placed it on my desk. The front page headline read, Sinclair Capital cancels $180 million expansion project. I looked up. What happened? Margaret smiled. The market happened. Then she added quietly, and people who build castles on borrowed money eventually run out of bricks. I turned the page. Victoria's photograph filled half the article. Her confident smile was gone. Investors were pulling out. Banks were demanding repayment. The Sinclair empire was beginning to crack. And for the first time in 2 years, I wondered something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. If Victoria was losing everything, what would happen to the man who had traded me? For her fortune? I didn't know it yet. But somewhere across the city, Daniel Harper had just made another desperate decision. One that would eventually lead him right back into my life. The newspaper stayed on my desk for days. Every headline told the same story. Sinclair Capital delays expansion. Major investors pull funding. Luxury developments put on hold. To everyone else, it looked like a temporary setback. To Margaret, It looked like the beginning of the end. She folded the newspaper and smiled. Never mistake expensive clothes for real wealth. 3 months later. She was right. Sinclair Capital announced its first round of layoffs. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Projects stopped overnight. Banks demanded repayments. The company that once seemed untouchable was bleeding money. I wondered if Daniel finally regretted his decision. Then I stopped wondering. His life was no longer my business. Mine was just beginning. By early 2004, Northbridge Consulting officially existed. Not in a glamorous office. Not with dozens of employees. Just me. A rented room above an old bookstore. A second-hand desk. A fax machine that jammed every other day. And one client. A local manufacturing company willing to take a chance on someone nobody knew. When I signed my first contract, worth $4,800, I celebrated with a cheeseburger and a soda. It wasn't much, but it was honest. Nobody had handed it to me. I had earned it. Margaret visited every Friday. She never complimented me. She criticized everything. Your proposal is too long. Your pricing is too low. Stop apologizing before every meeting. At first, it frustrated me. Later, I realized she wasn't trying to break me. She was preparing me. 5 years passed. Then 7. Then 10. Northbridge quietly expanded. 1 client became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became hundreds. We opened offices in Chicago. Then Milwaukee. Then Indianapolis. Every dollar we earned went back into the business. No luxury cars. No flashy parties. No magazine interviews. While others chased attention, I chased consistency. In 2013, a national business magazine published an article, America's fastest growing consulting firms. Northbridge ranked number 3. I stared at the magazine cover for almost a minute. Not because we were famous, but because the company everyone said I'd never build now employed more than 400 people. Margaret smiled when she saw the article. I told you. Execution beats ideas. I laughed. It took 12 years. She nodded. The strongest buildings always take longer. That same year, we moved into our new headquarters. A beautiful 12-story glass building overlooking downtown Chicago. Standing in the lobby on opening day, I remembered Daniel laughing at my dreams. I remembered Victoria asking, "What's the company's name?" Now, that name hung above the entrance in polished steel. Northbridge Consulting. I didn't feel revenge. I felt peace. Or at least, I thought I did. One Monday morning, Human Resources delivered a stack of executive applications to my office. Normally, I never reviewed entry-level resumes. That wasn't my job anymore. But one application caught my attention. Not because of the experience. Because of the photograph. The man had grown a beard. His hair was shorter. He wore glasses. The name read, David Harper. My heart skipped. Harper. I looked closer. Same eyes. Same crooked smile. Same tiny scar above the left eyebrow. Daniel. He wasn't fooling anyone. At least, not me. I opened the resume. His employment history was strange. Short-term jobs. Long gaps. References that couldn't be verified. One section immediately caught my attention. Previous employer, Sinclair Capital. Position, Senior Strategy Director. I almost laughed. That title didn't exist when he worked there. He was still lying, even after all these years. Then I reached the final page. Reason for leaving previous employment. Company restructuring. Such polite words. For total collapse. I pressed the intercom. Emily? My assistant answered immediately. Yes, Ms. Bennett? Schedule an interview. She sounded surprised. For Mr. David Harper? Yes. Tomorrow morning. A brief silence followed. Then, understood. After hanging up, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I should have rejected the application immediately. It would have been easy. One click. One signature. One rejection email. Instead, I found myself remembering something Margaret once told me. The smartest revenge never announces itself. A slow smile appeared on my face. Daniel believed he was applying for a job. He had no idea. He had just volunteered to become part of my plan. The next morning, the receptionist called my office. Miss Bennett, your 10 o'clock interview is here. I straightened my jacket, picked up Daniel's resume, then said 5 words. That would change both our lives forever. Send Mr. Harper inside. The office door opened slowly. A man stepped inside carrying a worn leather portfolio. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. Time had changed Daniel Harper. The expensive confidence was gone. His designer suits had been replaced by an ordinary navy blazer. The watch he'd once loved to show off was gone. So was the arrogance in his smile. But his eyes, they hadn't changed. They still searched every room, looking for opportunity. He looked at me politely. Good morning. I'm David Harper. I smiled professionally. Please, have a seat. Not even a flicker of recognition crossed his face. 12 years had changed me too. Shorter hair, sharper business attire, a different surname on every company document. To him, I was simply another executive, exactly as I wanted. He handed me his resume. I appreciate the opportunity. I nodded. I've read your application. Interesting background. He smiled confidently. I've learned a lot over the years. Mostly from failure, I thought. But I simply said, I'm sure you have. For the next 20 minutes, I asked ordinary interview questions. Leadership, conflict resolution, business ethics. Every answer sounded rehearsed. Every sentence carefully polished. Then I asked one question he wasn't expecting. Tell me about a time you failed. For the first time. He hesitated. Then he smiled. I prefer to focus on success. I wrote something in my notebook. He noticed. What did you write? I looked up. That wasn't the answer. The room became quiet. Daniel cleared his throat. My biggest mistake was trusting the wrong business partners. Not once did he mention Claire. Not once did he mention betrayal. Not once did he admit his own mistakes. Some people grow older. Very few grow honest. I closed the folder. One last question. If you discovered an employee had stolen someone else's business idea years ago, what would you do? His expression froze. Only for a heartbeat. Then he laughed. I suppose I'd investigate. Interesting. He hadn't denied it. He'd simply changed the subject. I stood, walked toward the window. Without turning around, I asked quietly, do you believe people deserve second chances? Daniel answered immediately. I do. Everyone makes mistakes. I smiled to myself. Only when they need something. I turned back toward him. Mr. Harper, we have an opening. His eyes lit up. It's an entry-level operations position. The smile faded. I'm applying for senior management. I nodded. I know. This is the only position I'm offering. He looked disappointed, then embarrassed. Finally, he forced a smile. I'll take it. Of course he would. He didn't have another choice. As he signed the employment papers, he looked around my office. Who founded Northbridge? I answered calmly. A woman. He smiled. She must be brilliant. I couldn't help it. I almost laughed. She worked very hard. He nodded. I'd like to meet her someday. You probably will. 3 days later, Daniel started work. Employee ID, number 4472. Department, Operations Support. His desk sat near the copy room. 2 floors below the executive offices. No private office. No assistant. No reserved parking space. Just a small cubicle. Exactly like the one where I'd started years ago. The employees liked him immediately. Daniel still had that gift. He remembered names. Brought coffee for coworkers. Stayed late. Volunteered for extra assignments. Within weeks, people were saying the same thing they'd once said about him years ago. He's going places. I had heard those words before. Every Friday, department managers submitted performance reports. Daniel's name kept appearing. Hardworking. Friendly. Reliable. I read every report personally. Not because I doubted them. Because I was waiting. People don't change overnight. Eventually. Pressure reveals character. One afternoon, I watched the security cameras from my office. Daniel was helping a new employee understand a spreadsheet. He seemed patient. Kind. For a brief moment, I wondered if 12 years had truly changed him. Then, he did something familiar. He quietly took credit for an idea the new employee had suggested only minutes earlier. The manager praised Daniel. The younger employee stayed silent. I leaned back in my chair. There he was. The same Daniel. Just better at hiding it. That evening, Emily entered my office. Ms. Bennett, the annual compliance audit starts next month. I nodded. I know. She handed me a folder. The auditors need someone to coordinate the entire project. A role with access to thousands of company records. Financial files. Vendor contracts. Archived emails. Exactly the position I'd been waiting for. I looked at one name on the staffing list. Then picked up my pen. Next to Daniel Harper. I wrote one word. Approved. Emily looked surprised. Are you sure? I closed the folder. Very. Because Daniel thought he'd just been given the opportunity of a lifetime. He had no idea. He had just accepted the most dangerous assignment of his life. Daniel couldn't hide his excitement. When his manager handed him the assignment, he practically rushed upstairs. Congratulations, the manager said. The CEO personally approved you to lead the compliance preparation team. Daniel blinked. The CEO? The manager smiled. She doesn't usually notice entry-level employees. You must have impressed someone. Daniel tried to stay calm. But the second he walked back to his desk, he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, he believed luck had finally returned. He had no idea. Luck had nothing to do with it. From the security room on the 12th floor, I watched everything. Every conversation. Every report. Every decision. Emily stood beside me. You're giving him access to almost every department. I nodded. I know. What if he steals information? I smiled. He won't. She looked confused. Why are you so sure? Because people like Daniel only steal when they think nobody is watching. This time, he is. The annual compliance audit wasn't just paperwork. Every contract signed during the last 15 years. Every vendor payment. Every acquisition. Every archived email. Had to be verified. Thousands of files. Millions of dollars. It was impossible for one person to review everything. Daniel needed help. So I gave him a team. 3 employees. And one of them worked directly for me. Her name was Rachel Morgan. Officially, she was a senior compliance analyst. Unofficially, she reported everything Daniel did. On Daniel's first day leading the project, Rachel noticed something strange. He wasn't reviewing files in order. He kept searching for one specific company. She wrote the name in her notebook. Sinclair Capital. That caught my attention immediately. Why would he care about records from a company that had collapsed years ago? Unless he was looking for something. Or hoping something had disappeared. 2 days later, Rachel walked into my office carrying a folder. You should see this. She placed several photocopies on my desk. Daniel had requested archived vendor contracts. Nothing unusual. Except, he requested the same contract. For different times. Each request was for a different year. I studied the dates. The years immediately after he left me. He wasn't browsing. He was searching. That evening, I called Frank Sullivan, the retired investigator who now worked as Northbridge's independent fraud consultant. He answered on the second ring. Claire, it's been a while. I need you back. He laughed softly. I was wondering when you'd call. The next morning, Frank arrived carrying a thick briefcase. His hair was grayer. His posture hadn't changed. He looked over Daniel's file for almost 20 minutes. Then he quietly asked, Do you remember Sinclair Capital's bankruptcy? I do. Frank opened his briefcase. I've spent the last 6 months reviewing public records. He slid one document toward me. It wasn't just bad investments. I frowned. What do you mean? There was internal fraud. I looked at the report. Several $1 million had disappeared. Months before Sinclair Capital collapsed. No one had ever been blamed. The investigation simply stopped. Frank tapped one page. There was one employee with access to every financial record. My stomach tightened. I already knew the answer. Frank slowly turned the page. At the bottom, one name appeared. Daniel Harper. I looked at Frank. Are you telling me? He nodded. I think your ex didn't just betray you. I think he betrayed Sinclair Capital too. Suddenly, everything made sense. The luxury cars. The expensive suits. The confidence. Daniel hadn't been living off Victoria's wealth. Someone had been paying him. 3 days later, Rachel called me. Her voice sounded tense. Claire, I found something. What? There are missing invoices. Someone removed them years ago. I stood up. Can you prove it? I think so. But there's something even stranger. What? Rachel took a deep breath. Daniel found the same invoices. And he looked terrified. That afternoon, I watched Daniel through the security cameras. He sat alone in the archive room, holding one old invoice. His hands were shaking. He whispered something to himself. I couldn't hear the words. Then, he looked directly at the security camera, almost as if he knew someone was watching. A second later, he folded the document, slipped it inside his briefcase, and quietly walked out of the archive room. I smiled, because that's exactly what I'd hoped he would do. He thought he was hiding evidence. In reality, he had just created new evidence. An hour later, Frank entered my office carrying another folder. I've confirmed it. Confirmed what? The invoice Daniel took is the only original copy left. I looked at him carefully. So now what? Frank smiled. Now, we wait. People like Daniel always make the same mistake. They don't stop after the first lie. They keep digging until they bury themselves. The following Monday morning, every executive in the company received the same email. Mandatory board meeting. Attendance required. Topic: Internal audit findings. Daniel received the invitation too. He smiled when he read it. He thought he was about to be recognized for leading the audit. He even bought a new tie for the meeting. What he didn't know was that his name was already printed on the last page of the board's confidential report, and in less than 24 hours. The truth he'd spent 12 years running from would finally be waiting for him. Daniel arrived 40 minutes early. He'd even bought a new charcoal gray suit, not because he could afford it, because he wanted to look successful. As he walked through the executive lobby, employees smiled and congratulated him. Great job on the audit. I heard the board is impressed. You might be getting promoted. Daniel smiled modestly. But inside, his confidence had returned. For the first time in years, he believed he was about to reclaim the life he'd lost. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. A polished walnut table stretched across the room. 22 executives were already seated. The company's outside auditors, corporate attorneys, department heads, and 3 independent board members. Daniel had never seen so many powerful people gathered in one place. He quietly took the only empty chair at the far end of the table. Then he noticed something strange. The CEO's chair was still empty. He whispered to the executive beside him. Has the CEO arrived yet? The man smiled. She always makes an entrance. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights dimmed. A large screen came to life. The company's secretary stood. This special meeting is now in session. Our agenda today is not financial performance. It is integrity. Daniel frowned. That wasn't what he'd expected. The first presentation began. Charts, graphs, audit statistics, routine information. Daniel relaxed. Everything looked normal. Maybe this really was a promotion meeting. Then, the screen changed. A single photograph appeared. Sinclair Capital Headquarters. Taken in 2001. Daniel stopped breathing. The room grew silent. One board member spoke. 12 years ago. A financial collapse destroyed thousands of careers. Official investigations concluded. There was insufficient evidence. Another slide appeared. Old accounting records. Vendor payments. Bank transfers. Every document carried the Sinclair logo. Daniel slowly gripped the edge of the table. His palms were sweating. Then, another voice spoke. Last month, our internal audit unexpectedly uncovered documents connected to that collapse. Daniel looked toward the screen. Those documents were the same ones he'd reviewed, the same ones he'd tried to hide. The lights brightened slightly. Frank Sullivan walked into the room carrying a thick binder. Daniel recognized him immediately. His face turned pale. No, he whispered. Frank placed the binder on the table. Ladies and gentlemen, we recovered every missing invoice, every altered contract, and every deleted payment authorization. Daniel's heartbeat echoed in his ears. Impossible. He'd removed the last invoice. Hadn't he? Frank clicked a remote. The next slide appeared. Security footage. Archive room. Northbridge headquarters. Timestamp. 3 weeks earlier. Daniel watched himself on the giant screen, opening the file cabinet, removing the original invoice, sliding it into his briefcase. The room remained completely silent. One executive slowly removed his glasses. Another leaned back in disbelief. Daniel couldn't move. Frank smiled calmly. Mr. Harper believed this was the only original copy. He paused. It wasn't. Another document appeared. Then another. Then another. Every missing record already existed in secure digital archives. Daniel hadn't destroyed evidence. He'd only proven. He intended to. His voice trembled. I can explain. No one answered. Then, the doors opened. Every executive stood. Daniel turned around. His face drained of color. A woman walked into the boardroom wearing a dark navy suit. Confident. Calm. Respected. Every person in the room greeted her the same way. Good morning, Ms. Bennett. Daniel stared. His mouth slowly fell open. Claire. It couldn't be. The woman he'd abandoned. The woman he'd mocked. The woman he'd believed would never succeed. Was the CEO. Claire walked past him without saying a word. She sat at the head of the table, opened a leather folder, looked directly at Daniel. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. Good morning, Daniel, he whispered. You knew. Claire nodded once. From the moment your resume arrived, Daniel looked around the room desperately. You hired me. Claire smiled. Yes, but why? She folded her hands. Because sometimes, the truth walks into your office, all by itself. Daniel stood abruptly. This is revenge. Claire remained perfectly calm. No, if this were revenge, I would have rejected your application. She leaned forward. This is accountability. Frank placed one final folder in front of every board member. Inside were sworn statements, bank records, archived emails, and one document Daniel had forgotten even existed. A signed proposal from 2001. Northbridge Consulting. Created by Claire Bennett. Submitted by Daniel Harper. Without her knowledge. Without her permission. Daniel closed his eyes. There was nowhere left to run. Claire looked at him one last time. Her voice remained steady. You once told me, love doesn't pay the bills. She paused. Maybe not. But honesty builds companies. The room fell silent. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. But Claire wasn't finished. Because one final decision would determine whether Daniel left that room with a future or with nothing at all. The boardroom remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Daniel stared at the folder in front of him. Every page contained another lie he'd told. Every document erased another excuse. For 12 years, he had blamed everyone else. His bosses, his coworkers, the economy. Bad luck. Now, There was nobody left to blame. Except himself. One of the board members finally broke the silence. Mr. Harper, do you deny any of this evidence? Daniel looked around the room. 22 faces. Not one showed sympathy. He swallowed hard. No. The word barely escaped his lips. Another board member asked, did you knowingly present Ms. Bennett's business proposal to Sinclair Capital as your own? Daniel closed his eyes. Yes. Were you aware that the proposal belonged entirely to her? Yes. Did you attempt to remove company records during the audit? After several painful seconds. Yes. Every admission felt like another brick falling from the wall he'd spent years building. Claire never interrupted. She simply listened. Calm. Patient. The way she'd imagined this moment 100 times over. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just with certainty. The truth didn't need her help anymore. It was speaking for itself. Daniel suddenly looked at Claire. I know what you're thinking. You want to destroy me. Claire shook her head. No. If I wanted that, I would have done it years ago. He frowned. Then why? Claire stood slowly, walked toward the large windows overlooking Chicago. Without turning around, she said, because I wanted you to succeed. Just enough to believe you'd escaped your past. The room stayed silent. People reveal who they really are when they think they've won. She turned back toward him. When you applied here, I had already forgiven you. Daniel looked confused. You forgave me? Yes, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Claire nodded toward Frank. Frank pressed a button on the remote. A final slide appeared. It wasn't financial evidence. It wasn't an email. It was Daniel's employment record at Northbridge. Every compliment. Every performance review. Every achievement. Then, one final page appeared. Violation of company ethics. Intentional removal of protected records. False information on employment application. Misrepresentation of prior experience. The room understood immediately. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what Daniel had done. Inside Northbridge, the chairman of the board adjusted his glasses. Mr. Harper, the board has reached a unanimous decision. You are terminated. Effective immediately. Additionally, Northbridge Consulting will notify industry compliance organizations that your employment ended because of verified ethical violations. Daniel looked up. What does that mean? Frank answered quietly. It means every major consulting firm in the country will know why you left. No prison, no lawsuit, but no executive position will ever trust you again. Daniel's shoulders collapsed. His career was over. He turned toward Claire one last time. I've lost everything. Claire looked directly into his eyes, then delivered the sentence she'd carried with her for 12 years. You wanted a shortcut to success. She paused. I wanted the truth to find you. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody needed to. The silence said everything. Daniel slowly picked up his worn briefcase. It suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. As he reached the door, he stopped. I really loved you once. Claire smiled sadly. No. You loved the version of me you thought would never surpass you. He lowered his head. Because he knew. She was right. Without another word, he walked out. The door closed behind him. For good. 3 months later, Northbridge completed the purchase of an aging office building across downtown Chicago. Most executives saw it as another smart investment. Only Emily knew why Claire had chosen that address. It was the very same building where, 12 years earlier, Daniel had laughed at her dream. The faded company sign was removed. A new one replaced it. Large silver letters reflected the morning sun. Northbridge Consulting. Claire stood across the street, looking at the entrance. Emily smiled. You finally got your revenge. Claire shook her head gently. No. I got my future. She walked through the front doors, without looking back, because the greatest revenge was never making Daniel watch her succeed. It was building a life so extraordinary that his betrayal became nothing more than the first chapter of her success.